Now everything is coming to light how the Federal Reserve, the central bank in the US, has been corrupt for decades and has lied to us. The former president of the World Bank is now bringing everything to light, how the Fed has lost trillions of dollars and has created an illusion of financial stability in the US through secret buying programs. But it's all just a big illusion, and we've all fallen for it. But it gets even crazier because Elon Musk has called for an audit of the Federal Reserve to check it out. Ron Paul is now reacting to this, the driver that ultimately drove this whole thing forward, by closing the Federal Reserve. And Ron Paul is now saying that auditing the Fed would automatically lead to its collapse, because ultimately so much stuff would come to light that the Fed would no longer be sustainable. This whole thing is packed with explosive potential and is really going viral right now. We're seeing so many people speaking out about ending the Fed, basically calling to just shut the whole thing down. This tweet from Elon Musk, where he basically asks if it's a good idea to appoint Ron Paul as the head of the Fed, has somehow racked up 40 million views. So this whole thing is just skyrocketing, going ultra viral. So this whole thing is happening. Super steep, super viral. Ron Paul also adds and says, hey, at the end of the day, they're all ideas. And if people eat up the ideas from the Federal Reserve, then it works. As soon as people realize that it's not working anymore, that it's a huge scam, once this idea hits the mainstream, then the Fed won't have any sustainability left. And it's just wild, the statements that are being made here every hour, every day. We need to take a really close look at this. And it also has ultimate consequences for Bitcoin. With Bitcoin, there's also an alternative to central bank money, to the fiat money system, to the Fed. It's basically the lack of transparency that creates all these backdoor stories. I mean, check this out, there's a tweet here. And here it's just being said, hey, raise your hands if you want Ron Paul as the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And this whole thing has 40 million views. Can you believe it? So crazy. We're really seeing a sentiment for freedom here. People don't want to be oppressed any longer. And we're going to take a look at the statement right now. Here from the former World Bank president, because this is the craziest thing I've heard in a long time, how the Fed basically gambled away trillions. And it's like they're maintaining some sort of financial stability. Or they're maintaining an illusion of financial stability by secretly running bond buying programs behind the scenes. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. But before we check that out, let's take a look at Ron Paul's statements, where he basically confirms that the Fed has to collapse as soon as it gets audited and checked. Just crazy.
One time I had a libertarian come up to me. He says, I'm not happy with your position on the Fed. And I said, why is that? He says, you don't want to end it. I said, what do you mean? He says, you only want to audit it. No, folks, I want to audit it as a process of when the people demand, oh boy, we need to end this, sort of like USAID.
Yeah. As a libertarian, I came up to him and said, hey, Ron Paul, you can't just say that we should only audit the Fed. We really need to shut down the Fed. And then Ron Paul said, no, you don't understand. If we audit the Fed, the central bank in the US, it will automatically lead to the Federal Reserve being shut down in that process. And by that, he implies that the Federal Reserve is so deeply involved in the mess that it's almost impossible to imagine it happening here. He basically says it's just like with USAID. You can't just say, okay, we're going to review this, because when you come in to audit, you have to shut the whole thing down. There are so many scandals that get uncovered with USAID, I still have no idea how to pronounce it. So many things have come to light. And now you can't just say, okay, hey, we're going to reform the whole thing and let it keep running. Instead, you really have to come to the conclusion that, hey, this thing needs to be shut down, we're closing the whole thing, no more USAID. And that's exactly what's going to happen with the Fed. If we do an audit here, it will automatically lead to the Federal Reserve being shut down. I can't say for sure what will come to light here, but it's probably going to be the craziest revelations. In American history, at least, if we can trust the statements from Ron Paul. He's been at this for about 20 years or so, or maybe 10 years. I don't know, a really long time, wanting to shut down the Fed. In the end, it's definitely a very, very difficult undertaking. He also says later in the interview, you can't just think of it as an easy thing. Just because a lot of people are demanding it right now and it's going viral, just because everyone wants it, doesn't mean it's actually going to happen. So we definitely need to backtrack a bit here. It doesn't mean that the Fed is going to collapse and be shut down tomorrow, or something like that, but first, awareness needs to be created. He also says it all depends on the people. Ultimately, if people feel that something is wrong here, then pressure can be applied, then change can happen. But as long as people just go along with things, and that's been the case for the last 100 years, then nothing will happen. And now check out his second statement here.
Pete, if you went in there and you just really ripped the lid off of it, what kinds of stuff do you think you'd see?
Where have we been for so long? Why didn't our schools teach something about the Constitution? Why did the schools give up on the idea of the tradition of our country, talking about silver and gold as being the only legal tender we were allowed? And that is, still changing. So
he explains that there is a Constitution, that there are certain rights, and so on. And why isn't that explained here in school? It's about to get really, really interesting. It will also explain why the only legal tender here in the USA is currently gold and silver. And it makes it really, really difficult for the government to engage in corruption, but all of that gets undermined. By not using gold and silver, You can just introduce massive corruption through the Ponzi scheme of fiat money, through the Federal Reserve, and a lot more.
But I think has to be done. What I'm delighted about right now that's going on is, the Constitution is clear that the states can only use gold and silver as legal tender to keep the federal government honest. And I think that is just great. And so we've been working with the states that it's their responsibility to use only gold and silver, but the federal government won't let them.
Yeah.
One of the answers will be competing currencies. And the competing currencies, from my viewpoint, shouldn't be strictly limited except by the laws of fraud.
Yeah.
Fraud and deceit, that, and then let the market decide.
So, I'm not a legal expert or anything, but Ron Paul actually says here, and I wasn't aware of this, feel free to write in the comments if you knew about this, whether it's true or not. Like I said, I'm not an expert here, but he actually says that only gold and silver are constitutionally allowed as legal tender at the state level. I actually did some research to see if what Ron Paul is saying is true. I asked ChatGPT about this, and it actually says yes, according to the US Constitution, Article BLA, states are only allowed to use gold and silver as legal tender for settling debts. The wording of the Constitution says, no, state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debt. And that's just crazy. And that keeps the government honest here, because that's always the argument where, for example, people say, Bitcoin makes war unaffordable. And it's the same with gold. Some people might say, hey, during the gold standard, things weren't so warlike because you can't just print gold out of thin air. You can't just live way beyond your means like that. And in the end, he says that it's tolerated here that the states also use fiat money, which opens the door to corruption, because only through fiat money is it possible for corruption to happen on a really, really large scale. None of this is possible if we have gold, if we have silver. But it's also not possible if we have Bitcoin. With Bitcoin, it's even less possible. And that's the crazy thing, that the Federal Reserve is now being actively attacked, that people are starting to advocate for hard money again, and that people are really, really sharp, criticize fiat money. And that's an ultimate argument for Bitcoin. I mean, if this keeps gaining traction and more people realize, hey, this whole fiat money Ponzi scheme is a huge scam, what do you think will happen to the Bitcoin price? Then people will flee from fiat money in droves and look for a safe haven. Could be gold, silver, or for the younger folks or those who get it, Bitcoin. There are even bets here now. For example, a Big X account says, I bet one Bitcoin that Trump will end the Federal Reserve and will complement or replace it with crypto. This is, of course, meant as a bit of a joke, that Donald Trump will ultimately end up with Ron Paul and Elon Musk at the Federal Reserve. And then he might introduce a Bitcoin standard or a crypto standard or something like that. Like I said, we need to be a little cautious about this and maybe dial it back a bit. This isn't going to happen that quickly. Whitney Webb even has one very, very interesting warning. She basically says that it could actually be bad if the Fed gets shut down, which is something you wouldn't really expect, but her argument is definitely very, very interesting. She's also an investigative journalist. She says here, you could argue that the Fed was created as a way for the banks to secretly control the money supply. We'll get to that later about the secret control of the money supply. If the powers that be decide to abolish the Fed, would you put the money supply directly in the hands of this bank so that no federal intermediary would be needed anymore? Mark Gold has documented a good part of this in this series. So Mark Gold has basically published the book, The Bitcoin Dollar Theory and stuff like that, where it's exactly about things like how the Fed operates secretly behind the scenes. It's a very, very corrupt organization that isn't audited, that no one checks, and that no one elected. It's neither federal nor does it have reserves. So how crazy is that? By the way, I'm at the beach now, check this out. It's a bit cloudy today. It doesn't happen that often around here, but today it actually is. Let's freaking go. And that's also because they don't have direct access to the government. So Donald Trump can't just shutting down the Fed. That just sounds ridiculous. Like we're just going to close the Fed and that's it. They can't really do that because Donald Trump doesn't have the authority to just shut down the Fed. I have to emphasize this again because I keep talking about the Federal Reserve and I always get comments down below. The comments, hey, also mention that the Fed is basically a private bank. It's not a government bank. But what about me now? The most shocking statement I've heard in a really long time was from the former president of the World Bank. Just give it a listen and then I'll give you my take on that.
It's so worrisome. But, the Fed basically has become now just a giant hedge fund. It's lost $1 trillion, and counting. It's going to be a gigantic loss. What it does is borrows money at 5.4% from banks and then dumps it into government bonds. So think what that trade does. That causes the government to think that it's better off than it is. And so that encouraged the government to be short when rates were zero. So why did the government, borrow so much in T-bills? Well, because the Fed was buying the bonds and it made it look like yields were going to stay low for remember the low for long phrase. So we've got these multiple problems that are going on and it endangers the dollar. So that's the basic case.
There was a really good summary of this statement that I honestly can't describe any better than how it's already presented here. Here it says, a former president of the World Bank raised the alarm and announced that the Federal Reserve had lost over $1 trillion. And it would just keep growing. And because of that, it has become nothing more than a huge hedge fund for the rich and powerful. You really have to take that in. In the end, that's always what I tell you. The Federal Reserve, the fiat money system, is a massive redistribution system. Where people profit, those are the ones at the money printing source. And now the former president of the World Bank is saying that it has basically become a giant hedge fund for the rich and powerful, but it goes even further. He claimed that the Fed borrows money from the banks at an interest rate of 5.4% and then invests it in government bonds. This creates the illusion that the government's financial situation is better than it actually is. He warns that this scheme is not just limited to the US, but is happening with central banks all around the world. And folks, that is one of the craziest statements ever, because that means we will see a huge bailout from all countries around the world. That means states would probably be way less solvent if central banks weren't actively stepping in and buying up government bonds. Because nothing else is happening here than what he's saying, that there's basically illegal state financing going on. That the central banks are either consciously, publicly, or maybe even secretly buying up government bonds from the US, maybe from Europe, from other countries, and so on. This creates the illusion that government bonds are in demand on the official market. People think, yeah, a lot of people are buying that, and that's why interest rates might go down or something like that. Because if no one buys the government bonds, then interest rates go up. But if there is an illusion of buyers here, it's like starting up some cryptocurrency or something like that. And then there are just so many, let's say, scam buyers who don't actually exist in the real world, but some bots that simply buy the cryptocurrency or something like that here. Then of course you have the illusion, wow, this must be a really cool coin because it has a huge amount of liquidity, there's a huge amount of trading going on here and so on. And when people realize, hey, that this Ponzi scheme is actually in motion, and that the demand for government bonds isn't really that high, but that it's just one big scam and you were part of that scam without even realizing it, then there really needs to be an audit for the Federal Reserve. Very dangerous, extremely dangerous. Could this lead to the entire dollar system being turned upside down, maybe even collapsing? Who knows, maybe people will lose trust in the system. And that's why it's such a hot topic.
And this is on a global basis. It's not just the Fed. It's all the major central banks doing the same thing, meaning taking money from the economy in order to buy government bonds. We need to be clear on that.
So he confirms again that basically any central bank worldwide, if it were audited, wouldn't pass the test. Because then it would come out that there's an illusion being created of a state that is solvent, or something like that, or where there's demand for government bonds. But it is a very common scam that people simply embellish their balance sheets behind the scenes by buying government bonds. And I don't really know exactly how that happens because there are already the official QE programs like the ones we had during COVID and so on. But as I understand it here, that in addition to the official QE programs, it's just kind of behind the scenes somehow through. I don't know exactly how it works, but somehow through some kind of secret missions. At least that's what I'm taking out here. States and the government bonds are being propped up by the Fed or other central banks around the world. And the money to buy the government bonds does not come from printing money, but rather from redistributing money from the economy. And then they pump it back into government bonds. But how exactly it works in detail is still a question. So I didn't really explain that in detail. And it's definitely a total scandal that could potentially come to light. If that comes to light, it would definitely cause a shockwave, like you can hardly imagine. That's why it's even more important to have Bitcoin now, to have alternatives outside of the traditional money system, the classic fiat currency system. I'll put a link down below showing you how you can easily and safely buy Bitcoin. Here, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin with the code. Here, you can also set up savings plans and auto wallet transfers. Here, you can set limit orders and a lot more. Guys, let me know what you think about that. See you later. Peace out.